What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome in or welcome back to Sweet Emohotion, the YouTube show where we are sending Kerbals to Moho. I'm Weber, and this is going to be our last episode. That's right, the Kerbals are going home. Just a little bit of information about this ship. It has both SAS, RCS, and rocket engines. Now, the SAS is more efficient than the RCS when it comes to moving the ship around. The RCS can thrust the ship forward, and it's more efficient than the rocket engines, but the rocket engines are much more powerful. It gives us a bigger thrust-to-weight ratio. And I knew that I needed 840 meters per second delta V in order to get this thing into orbit. But my engines, they only really had 600 meters per second delta V. If you remember from the last episode, 610 to be precise. My SAS, the monopropellant level, I guess that's RCS, monopropellant level, was around 1,000 monopropellant units. I'm not really sure what that 1,000 stands for. It was around 1,000. So what I ended up doing was just sitting there with my finger on the H key, bleeding off my monopropellant into space. And that way I was actually able to bring my delta V from my rockets up to 800 meters per second. That was bringing my monopropellant level down to, like 140, somewhere around there. Now, 800 meters per second isn't quite enough to get us into orbit. So after that, we just use our RCS to just thrust ourselves forward and give us that extra 40 meters per second delta V, and we just barely make it. Like, we almost run into the side of a mountain thrusting forward, but we do make it into orbit. I also ran 2 rockets at a time, as you saw just before. That's because I thought that the 2 rockets at a time would be more efficient. But it didn't seem to give me any extra efficiency. There really was no extra delta V to that. This thing, I made it. I just barely make it. My monopropellant is almost out. And since this is the only ship with monopropellant on it, I was thinking of bringing it up to dock with that station. And then I sort of started to worry. This is the only ship with monopropellant on it, and it gets really, really hard to dock if you don't have monopropellant. I know it's possible. I've seen Scott Manley do it. And if it's possible, I guess Scott Manley can do it. But yeah, I started to get pretty worried about this guy being able to dock. Now, what's interesting about this is it doesn't show any shortcomings of my lander itself. It shows shortcomings of my piloting, because if you remember when we landed, the first time we landed, we actually had enough delta V to get ourselves into orbit. There were like 1,000 delta Vs left for us to get into orbit. That would have been easy, but, smart me, I decided that I wanted to use an extra 400 meters per second delta V to get this thing right next to the Moho. So this is a teachable moment here. If you land properly the first time, then you're probably not going to have issues like this later on. What we ended up having to do to relieve this issue that we're having is some standard orbital maneuverings. And this is a part where it's actually really lucky that we had this abandoned floating fuel tank, because in order to save weight on my crew transfer vessel, I didn't include any sort of probes on it. So this thing isn't going to function all by itself to, like, go get our crew. It would have been nice if it could have, but it's not. Also, if we were going to bring the entire station down, the efficiency would have been just horrible. I was able to save a little bit of extra fuel by bringing our rocket that had the probe on it down to get our guys that were in the lander and then bring them back up to the transfer vehicle and just transfer any extra fuel that they had. So here's our lander coming up to the little probe fuel station thingy in order to hitchhike a ride back to their return vehicle. And we're just going to do a standard docking here using this docking alignment indicator that I love so very, very much. And then just transfer it over back to the other vehicle in another pretty standard orbital maneuver that we've seen 100 times. And once again, they're going to dock this thing and swing it around. And this docking, I'm actually trying to be a little more efficient as far as monopropellant goes, because I have hardly any monopropellant left. And I would hate to get, just within a few seconds of docking this thing and then realize, no monopropellant, and we're heading towards it to crash into it or something like that. That would be a tragic end to a long and so far successful mission. So fortunately, they get docked quite easily, and we transfer the fuel over, and I did a cute little thing with the Kerbals transferring over, and, well, for some reason the footage is lost. I'm not quite sure why. Fraps is, it's not exactly the nicest to me sometimes, but, it's a pretty good program. So now we're just going to orbit ourselves out and get out of orbit. And I just want to get us into the solar system so we can try to get an encounter using our maneuver nodes with Kerbin. And I'm trying to do things without changing my plane, and just decided, you know what? It's easier. I have plenty of fuel. I'm just going to do a plane change maneuver. And after that plane change is done, then it's really easy to find an encounter with Kerbin. Just you sort of fish our maneuver node around in order to get essentially the most efficient connection with Kerbin. And this is where Conics Patch 0 comes in handy. It's really, once I have a connection with Kerbin, which actually was pretty close, use our Conics Patch 0 mode. All we got to do is focus in here on Kerbin, and then we can adjust our maneuver node to get ourselves a really, really accurate close encounter, like sort of exactly where we want it when we're coming in. This is great for efficiency purposes because you could do this when you get closer in, but the farther away from Kerbin you are, the easier it is, or the less delta V you need in order to make these sorts of connections with the planets that you want to. So here we are executing that maneuver node, and we're going to bring ourselves right into a nice orbit with Kerbin, and you can see when it shows that we're going to be flinging out like that, that's exactly when we come in. And you see right here, it might not be exactly what I wanted. It's close, but no matter, because we're going to be changing things a little bit once we get into the sphere of influence of Kerbin. So now all we got to do is coast there. Let Isaac Newton do his work and just pull ourselves right in just by waiting. It's the easiest part. So now that we've come in, we recognize that once we've moved into the sphere of influence, things have changed around a bit. It might not have been an exact approximation. See, it looks like we're going to hit Kerbal. But what we're going to do now is using the landing guidance show aerobrake nodes tool in Mechjeb, which is really useful. You see that purple line right there? That shows what our ship's going to do after we've been through the atmosphere. And you can see here, I realized I don't want to be orbiting around that way. I want to orbit the right way around the planet, counterclockwise, as we always do it. So I just set up a maneuver node, and see, this is still that orange maneuver node there. That's showing exactly what the atmosphere is going to do to our ship. So I'm just going to manually tweak this thing a little bit to get us into a nice orbit. And then all we got to do is do our aero braking. Just slam into the atmosphere of Kerbal, and the air itself is slowing our ship down. Because we planned everything out before, and we used this tool for checking what our aero braking is going to do to our ship, it's less of a guesstimation if we didn't have the Mechjeb plugin. If we didn't have the Mechjeb plugin, you could still do the math for it, and it would be somewhat accurate, but it's really just guesstimation. This is one of the most useful parts of the Mechjeb plugin, is this show aerobrake node. So now that we've gotten into orbit, we've swung around, and we're just bringing it down so we can land right next to the Kerbal Space Center. And this thing's set up so just the probe will land. That big piece, it's going to crash, and we don't want it anymore. All we want is the probe, because that's got our precious cargo. It's got all of the samples our Kerbals took from Moho, and the Kerbals themselves. And their little kitties would be very upset if they didn't make it through this particular part. So we can see in the background that launch stage is going to crash, and their parachutes are very nicely keeping them from meeting the same fate. And we did a pretty good landing that's using the same Mechjeb tool to figure out where we're going to land, and got us pretty darn happily close to the Kerbal Space Center. And so here they are. It's nice to see green with blue skies again after so many months out there. We're just going to select our ship now and hit the recover button. And that's going to bring our crew back in. And yep, the whole Space Center, the crowd is going wild. Everyone's cheering. Our three heroes are back home, ready to go out for another mission on another day. This has been Sweet Emohotions. Join us next. We're going to be explaining what our Kerbal scientists learned and what planet they're headed to next. I'm Weber, and as always, thanks for watching and stay entertained.